Chapter 4. The Rescue. The Hardy Boys knew that they had no time to lose. It was evident that the man in the water had been injured by the explosion and could not swim much longer. "We'll never reach him," Chet said, as the four boys dashed across the rocks and grass to the shore. Suddenly, Frank cried out, "I see a rowboat up on the beach." His sharp eyes had detected a large rowboat almost completely hidden in a small cove at the bottom of the cliff. "We'd make better time than that." A huge rock, jutting out of the water, cut the cove off from the open part of the beach. "We'd have to go up to that ridge and then down," Joe objected. "I'll swim out." "I will too," said Biff. The two plunged into the water and struck out for the stricken man. Meanwhile, Frank and Chet sped up on the slope, cut across a strip of grass, and began running down the embankment towards the rowboat. "The man's still afloat," Frank shouted as he looked out over the water. Joe and Biff were making good time, but were a long way from the man, who seemed now to be drifting with the ongoing tide. The explosion victim, fortunately, had managed to seize a piece of wreckage and was hanging onto it. Slipping and scrambling, Frank and Chet made their way down the slope. Rocks rolled and tumbled ahead of them, but finally they reached the bottom safely and examined the boat. It was battered and old, but evidently still seaworthy. There were two sets of oars. "Grab hold," Frank directed Chet. The boys pulled the boat across the pebbles and into the water. Swiftly they fixed the oars in the locks and took their places. Pulling hard, Frank and Chet rowed towards the distressed swimmer. Presently they overtook Joe and Biff, who clambered aboard. The man had seen the boys and called feebly for them to hurry. "Faster," Joe urged. "He looks as if he'll go under any second." The motorboat in the background was still blazing fiercely, flames shooting high in the air. The craft was plainly doomed. The boys pulled harder and the rowboat leapt across the water. When it was only a few yards away from the man, he suddenly let go of his bit of wreckage and slipped beneath the waves. "He's drowning," Chet shouted as he bent his oar again. Joe made a tremendously long outward dive and disappeared into the water where the man had gone down. Frank and Chet rowed the boat to the spot and leaned over the side to peer down. Just then, Joe and the stranger broke the surface of the water, with the boy holding an arm under the man's shoulder. His head sagged. "He's unconscious," Biff whispered hoarsely as he helped pull the victim onto the boat. The man sprawled helpless on the bottom, more dead than alive. "We'd better revive him and get him to the hospital," said Frank. He applied artificial respiration, forcing a little water from the man's lungs, but the stranger did not regain consciousness. "I think he collapsed from exhaustion," Joe spoke up. Frank and Chet took off their jackets and wrapped them around the wet figure. "How about taking them to the farmhouse over there, along the road?" Chet suggested. The others agreed. As Frank and Chet rowed towards the farm, the boys discussed the mystery. Who was the victim of the explosion, and why had the men in the other motorboat tried to kill him? The man they had rescued lay face down in the bottom of the boat. He was a slim, dark-haired man with sharp, clean-cut features, and his clothes were cheap and worn. Biff looked at his pockets for identification, but found none. "Wonder if he's a local man," Joe said. "Never saw him around town." The other boys declared they never had either. By this time, the boat was close to the shore. Joe and Biff leaped out and dragged it partway onto the beach. Then the four boys carried the unconscious man up the rocky shore towards the farmhouse. As they approached, a plump woman came hurrying out of the house. From the orchard nearby, a burly man in overalls came forward. My goodness, what has happened? The woman asked, running towards them. We just pulled this man out of the water, Frank explained. We saw your house. Bring him in, boomed the farmer. Bring him right in. The woman ran ahead and held the door open. The boys carried the stranger into the house and laid him on a bed in a comfortably furnished first-floor bedroom. The farmer's wife hastened to the kitchen to prepare a hot drink. Rub his ankles and wrists and get those wet clothes off him, the farmer told the boys. That will step up his circulation. I'll get him some pajamas. How about calling a doctor? Frank asked. No, Nate, no need. He'll be okay, the farmer declared. The victim was soon under the covers. Frank and Joe continued to massage his wrists and ankles. At last the stranger stirred feebly. His eyelids fluttered. His lips moved, but no words came. Then his eyes opened, and the man stared at those around him as though in a daze. Where am I? He muttered faintly. You're safe, Frank assured him. You're with friends. You saved me? Yes. Pretty near. Cashed in, didn't I? The nearly drowned. But you're all right now. You nearly drowned. But you're all right now. When you feel like talking, you can tell us the whole story, said Frank. But in the meantime, we'll call the police or the Coast Guard and report those men who tried to murder you. The man in the bed blinked and looked out of the window. Finally he said, No, don't do that. The boys were shocked. Why not? Joe burst out. The man was thoughtfully silent for a moment, then said, Thanks, but I'd rather let matters stand as they are. I'll take care of it as soon as I get back my strength. The rescued man turned to the farmer. Okay with you if I stay overnight? I'll pay you, of course. The farmer put out his hand. The name's Kane, and you're welcome to stay until you feel strong. Nobody can say I never turned a sick man away. And what's your name? The patient hesitated a moment. Jones. Bill Jones, he said at last. It was so evidently a false name that the Hardys glanced knowingly at each other. Mr. Kane did not seem to realize that his guest was apparently trying to hide his identity. Mrs. Kane appeared with hot broth and toast. She suggested that her husband and the boys let the patient rest for a while. When she joined them in the living room, she invited the boys to have a snack. Chet readily accepted for all of them. A snack consisted of sandwiches of home-cured ham with cheese, glasses of fresh milk, rich lemon pie, frothy with meringue. Chet beamed. Mrs. Kane, you need to open a restaurant. I'd be a steady customer. You're the best pie maker I've ever met. Frank, Joe, and Biff chuckled. How often do you hear their stout, food-loving chum? How often they had heard their stout, food-loving chum make similar remarks. But in this case, they had to agree with him and told Mrs. Kane so. She smiled. It's the least I can do for you boys who just saved someone's life. Her young guests said nothing of their early afternoon adventures inside the Pollitt house, but Frank casually asked the Kanes if they had known the deceased owner and if anyone was living there now. Sure, I knew Felix Pollitt, the farmer replied. Closed mouth, old codger, but I did hear him once say something about having a no-good nephew. Pollitt said he was his only living relative, and he supposed he'd have to leave the property to him. But who'd want the place? Mrs. Kane spoke up. It's falling apart. and it would cost a mint of money to fix up. Joe grinned. Sounds like a haunted house, he remarked pointedly. Funny you should say that. Mrs. Kane looked at Joe. There was a family stopped here the other day, wanted to buy some eggs. One of the little girls said that they had a terrible scare. They'd stopped at the old Pollitt place to have a picnic, and they were scared out of their wits by moans and groans and queer laughs from the house. Mr. Kane's face broke into a grin. The kid's imagination sure was running away with itself. I'm not so sure of that, his wife disagreed. I think some boys were in there playing pranks. After Frank and Joe and their friends had left the farmhouse, they discussed the strange noises at the Pollitt place from his new angle. Biff frowned. If those ghosts are from Bayport High, they'll sure have the laugh on us, he remarked. They sure will, Chet agreed. I'd hate to face them on Monday. Frank and Joe were not convinced. After they had dropped their chums at the Morton and Hopper homes, they discussed the day's strange and varied adventures all the way to the Hardy house. I'm sure the ghost business was meant to be something more of a prank, Frank stated. Right, his brother agreed. I just had an idea, Frank. Maybe nobody was in the house, but he could have rigged up a tape recorder to make those sounds from a remote control. What do you say we go back and take another look? I'm with you. By this time, the boys had turned into the long driveway of the Hardy house, a spacious, three-story clapboard house on the corner of High and Elm Streets. The large two-story garage at the rear of the attractive garden had once been a barn. Frank and Joe parked their motorcycles, unstrapped the telescope, and carried it to the back porch. As they entered the kitchen, they found their mother, a pretty, sweet-faced woman with sparkling blue eyes, preparing supper. Hello, boys, she greeted them. Did you have a good day? See any smugglers? They kissed her, and Frank said, We have a lot to tell you and Dad. He's in the study upstairs. He'll go up with you I'll go up with you right away, and we can talk while the chicken's roasting and the potatoes are baking. The three hurried up to the room where Mr. Hardy was busy looking to a large metal file in which he kept important records. The detective stopped his work and listened with rapt attention as Frank and Joe gave detailed accounts of their adventures. We sure fell for the cry for help, Joe exclaimed. I'm sorry about those stolen eyepieces from the telescope. And I hope it wasn't damaged when I had my spill, Frank added. He smiled wanly. You'll probably want to dismiss us from your detective force. Nothing of the kind, his father said. But now, let's discuss what you saw through the telescope. You said you spotted a man who climbed down the ladder of a boat and went off into a smaller one. Could he have been the same fellow who called himself Jones? We couldn't identify him, Joe replied. But he might be. Frank snapped his fingers. Yes, and he could be one of the smugglers. But who threw that hand grenade at him? Joe asked. No one of his own gang, surely. And those guys in the other speedboat? They couldn't have been the Coast Guard men, even in disguise. They wouldn't use grenades. Joe's right on the second point, Mr. Hardy agreed. But Jones may still be a smuggler. You mean he might have done something to make his boss mad, and the boss sent out a couple of his men to get him? Joe asked. The detective nodded. If this theory is right, we can persuade Jones to talk before either rejoins the gang or starts trying to take revenge. Then we might get him to turn in some state's evidence. The boys were excited. Both jumped from their chairs, and Joe cried out eagerly, "Let's go talk to him right away. By morning, he'll be gone.